Amnesty International report on the genocide in Gaza following. Intent to destroy. To establish Israel's specific intent to physically destroy Palestinians in Gaza as such, Amnesty International analyzed the overall pattern of Israel's conduct in Gaza, reviewed dehumanizing and genocidal statements by Israeli government and military officials, particularly those at the highest levels, and considered the context of Israel's system of apartheid, its inhumane blockade of Gaza, and the unlawful 57-year-old military occupation of the Palestinian territory. Before reaching its conclusion, Amnesty International examined Israel's claim that its military lawfully targeted Hamas and other armed groups throughout Gaza, and that the resulting unprecedented destruction and denial of aid were the outcome of unlawful conduct by Hamas and other armed groups, such as locating fighters among the civilian population or the diversion of aid. The organization concluded these claims are not credible. The presence of Hamas fighters near or within a densely populated area does not absolve Israel from its obligations to take all feasible precautions to spare civilians and avoid indiscriminate or disproportionate attacks. Its research found Israel repeatedly failed to do so, committing multiple crimes under international law for which there can be no justification based on Hamas actions. Amnesty International also found no evidence that the diversion of aid could explain Israel's extreme and deliberate restrictions on life-saving humanitarian aid. In its analysis, the organization also considered alternative arguments, such as ones that Israel was acting recklessly or that it simply wanted to destroy Hamas and did not care if it needed to destroy Palestinians in the process, demonstrating a callous disregard for their lives rather than genocidal intent. Our damning findings must serve as a wake-up call to the international community. This is genocide. It must stop now. Agnès Calamard, Amnesty International. However, regardless of whether Israel sees the destruction of Palestinians as instrumental to destroying Hamas or as an acceptable byproduct of this goal, this view of Palestinians as disposable and not worthy of consideration is in itself evidence of genocidal intent. Many of the unlawful acts documented by Amnesty International were preceded by officials urging their implementation. The organization reviewed 102 statements that were issued by Israeli government and military officials and others between October the 7th of 2023 and June the 30th of 2024, and dehumanized Palestinians, called for or justified genocidal acts or other crimes against them. Of these, Amnesty International identified 22 statements made by senior officials in charge of managing the offensive that appeared to call for or justify genocidal acts, providing direct evidence of genocidal intent. This language was frequently replicated, including by Israeli soldiers on the ground, as evidenced by audio-visual content verified by Amnesty International, showing soldiers making calls to erase Gaza or to make it uninhabitable, and celebrating the destruction of Palestinian homes, mosques, schools, and universities. Killing and causing serious bodily or mental harm. Amnesty International documented the genocidal acts of killing and causing serious mental and bodily harm to Palestinians in Gaza by reviewing the results of investigations it conducted into 15 airstrikes between October the 7th and April the 28th that killed at least 334 civilians, including 141 children, and wounded hundreds of others. Amnesty International found no evidence that any of these strikes were directed at a military objective. In one illustrative case, on April the 28th of 2024, an Israeli airstrike destroyed the Abdelal family house in Al-Jaina neighborhood in eastern Rafah, killing 3 generations of Palestinians, including 16 children, while they were sleeping. While these represent just a fraction of Israel's aerial attacks, they are indicative of a broader pattern of repeated direct attacks on civilians and civilian objects or deliberately indiscriminate attacks. The attacks were also conducted in ways designed to cause a very high number of fatalities and injuries among the civilian population. Inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction. The report documents how Israel deliberately inflicted conditions of life on Palestinians in Gaza intended to lead over time to their destruction. These conditions were imposed through three simultaneous patterns that repeatedly compounded the effect of each other's devastating impacts: damage to and destruction of life-sustaining infrastructure and other objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. The repeated use of sweeping, arbitrary and confusing mass evacuation orders to forcibly displace almost all of Gaza's population, and the denial and obstruction of the delivery of essential services, humanitarian assistance, and other life-saving supplies into and within Gaza. After October the 7th, Israel imposed a total siege on Gaza, cutting off electricity, water, and fuel. In the 9 months reviewed for this report, Israel maintained a suffocating, unlawful blockade, tightly controlled access to energy sources, failed to facilitate meaningful humanitarian access within Gaza, and obstructed the import and delivery of life-saving goods and humanitarian aid, particularly to areas north of Wadi Gaza. They thereby exacerbated an already existing humanitarian crisis. This, combined with the extensive damage to Gaza's homes, hospitals, water and sanitation facilities, and agricultural land, and mass forced displacement, caused catastrophic levels of hunger and led to the spread of diseases at alarming rates. The impact was especially harsh on young children and pregnant or breastfeeding women, with anticipated long-term consequences for their health. The international community's seismic, shameful failure for over a year to press Israel to end its atrocities in Gaza by first delaying calls for a ceasefire and then continuing arms transfers is and will remain a stain on our collective conscience. Agnès Calamar, Amnesty International.